Oh, so let's talk about some strategies to get your offer accepted, because you need to, buyers sometimes had the old theory that there was a lot of negotiating they could do. And hey, I don't want to overpay and I want to make my offer, gee, I don't want to pay more than I need to pay. Well, I haven't seen one accepted recently that didn't have their very best offer, maybe even as they got started. They're very, put your best foot forward might be the new mantra for buyers. Now, I hope there are quite a few of us tuned in today. Some of you are very experienced, and please feel free, unmute yourself, chime in, contribute. I might even have a thought that works that you tell me, oh no, that didn't work, or maybe in our market that didn't work. So let's talk about asking for personal property not offered by the seller. This is not the time to ask for their favorite couch or patio furniture or add anything like that. In some markets, it's typical for the refrigerator to stay, and some not. And if it's typical in your market for the refrigerator to stay, then that's not asking for anything extra. But when you pile on extra furniture, and I've seen, I don't know, now there might be somebody here from the East Tennessee resort market, and I know it's kind of common for them to sell their whole house and furniture and everything, but that's probably indicated in the MLS. So don't ask for extra personal property. Your next conversation with your buyer often is, how much earnest money are you willing to deposit? And asking for a larger amount of earnest money. After all, that's the definition of the word earnest. How earnest are you about buying this property? So this is not the time to put down $500. If they've got the money to come to closing, they need to show that amount to the seller as you write the offer. Then you might also.
Hey, Carol.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. We've seen in our market too, as far as earnest money, that we've seen non-refundable earnest money. They're so serious that they're just going to put the earnest money up and we're going to buy it, and we're going to make the earnest money non-refundable, which makes the seller feel a little bit more safe.
Yeah. I've seen recently in a real high price range property, one of the agents is working here, the sellers, one of his main concerns was under what conditions, he wanted it to be written that under any condition, he got to keep the earnest money. So that total non-refundable certainly would address that. The third point there, I said you might put in as a special stipulation to offer additional earnest money when you've met all the contingencies. I don't see that used as often as it might be to help the buyer.
Carol, how would you write that up? Do you write that up in special stipulations, or how do you write that, or what do you say?
Well, yes, I think I would put it in special stipulations. In Tennessee, the Tennessee contract has a space for that. And I think it would just be that the buyer is to deposit additional earnest money of X dollars when all financial and inspection contingencies are removed, or maybe no later than a certain date. Either way, I could see it would depend on the time and what a seller might agree to. Somebody else have a different suggestion on that language? Everybody happy with that?
I know in some states it's already included in the contract. There's a line for the earnest money and there's a line for the second earnest money. So it depends on what state you're in.
Where was that?
Used all the time in Florida. Used all the time.
And yet Arkansas did away with earnest money on the face of the contract. You have to add a second addendum. So everybody, you're right.
Wow.
Yeah, everybody treats earnest money differently. But I think sellers, when Arkansas did away with the earnest money as a line item on their purchase agreement, I was just floored. And immediately talked to a couple of the brokers at the larger offices there, and they said, well, everybody had gotten to where they were writing such small amounts in as earnest money. You know, they were dealing in lower price ranges in some markets, and maybe the buyer wasn't putting up but 100. Or that's what I'm saying, that in this kind of market, that is not, you know, that's probably not going to work. So I think sellers expect and like to see earnest money, maybe non-refundable in this market, true. So next, when you talk about the loan, and unfortunately, in our market, one of the reasons I said this guy in Quail Hollow's office had written 9 offers to get a buyer their first confirmed offer, they had to get a loan. And there's a lot of cash floating around. There's a lot of investors that are coming forward. And of course, I think the investors are actually getting an investor loan at their bank, that they know they have that line of credit secure. So they're writing their offers as cash. And it is tough when you're asking for a loan to beat a cash offer, because they know that when you're asking for a loan, there's certainly some hurdles to jump over, more so than in a cash offer. So if the buyer is getting a loan, this would be the time to put in the lowest loan to value possible. If they can put down 10% or they can put down 15%, that would be the time to do that. So the seller would have a little bit more confidence in their loan. Certainly include a pre-qualifying letter, and it needs to really look correct, that it came from a mainstream lender. I think the more local your lender, the more a seller is typically happy with that pre-qualifying letter. And I say signed with contact information. I mean signed by the lender, the loan originator, so that the seller's agent can feel free to call and verify, you know, I've got a loan pre-qualifying letter here for Susie Smith. And is there, you know, maybe you want to ask how much the close, you know, if there's closing costs being asked for, maybe you want to verify that. Maybe you want to verify that, that they are a direct lender, and maybe their underwriting, is it local or out of town? Whatever questions that the listing agent would like to ask, I think it's better to give them some contact information for that lender. Anything you can do to make the process of this negotiation go a little faster. Anybody else have a thought about a tip on this pre-qualifying letter situation? Nobody with a thought?
No, a lot of times those letters actually have a whole bunch of contingencies in it. So maybe meeting with the lenders that you use, like Community Mortgage, and saying, what all can we do, you know, before they actually have a contract? How far can you go into getting the information so that some of those contingencies can be, you know, not so hefty, if you will, so many of them listed. I do know it's hard to do that these days with the whole CFPB Dodd-Frank stuff, but just talking with the lender too, to find out, you know, how strong they feel the buyer is.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Those basic questions, you know, but never, I don't think in today's competitive market, you could be representing your buyer accurately or adequately even without having them, you know, pre-qualified at the time you submit the contract. And then literally, you know, this day of texting and let's pick up the phone, talk to the listing agent. Let's ask the listing agent for what is important to the seller. Let's start with the closing date. You know, would the seller really prefer as quick a closing date as possible, or would they like a little cushion? You know, try to get your offer written to the benefit of the seller anywhere anywhere you can. Now, in the repair issues, I think often the offers that I'm seeing accepted, the buyer is stating in his offer, again, maybe in special stipulations, that the seller will only be responsible for any lender required repairs. That does not mean that the buyer is waiving their right to the inspection. And you would have your buyer, obviously, after the inspection period, they have the option, as the contract is pre-written in Tennessee, and it's not this way in every state by any means, but let's say we did this, after the inspection, if there's something that they cannot live with and they would not want to buy the property without it being repaired, they can terminate the agreement. But you also, without waiving your right to the inspection, or waiving your right to terminate after the inspection, you can state that the seller would only be responsible for lender required repairs. I was in an office the other day and there was a misunderstanding, and the agent she'd communicated to her seller that they weren't going to be responsible for repairs. Well, the appraiser goes and the appraiser comes up with two fairly time-consuming repairs. And the seller said, and so it was 2 days before closing, and I heard her conversation with her seller. She said, so you've completed this and you complete, oh no, we didn't do that. You remember we said we weren't responsible for repairs. Well, she failed to have them understand that they were responsible for lender repairs. Somebody has to do the lender repairs. That can't be waived. So a little bit of misunderstanding there. Yes, you may. Miss Julie wants to interject here.
Good morning, everybody. One of these that I recently helped somebody with, the offer said seller only responsible for lender required repairs. But then after their inspection, they sent a repair request. And that was not an option. They already took it off the table. So what do you think the seller did?
Rejected.
They waited for the actual 2 remaining offers in the Tennessee contract, 2 remaining options that the buyer had. The buyer didn't send it. The seller said, well, you're buying it as is, of course.
Well, so what they do, kind of forget that they wrote it, that the seller wasn't responsible for any repair?
I think the buyer's agent was just going through the motions and forgot that.
Oh, maybe. Okay, then I say with caution, you might want to consider removing the contingency for appraising for the purchase price. However, the buyer, that's totally a buyer's decision. You know, I suspect Julie's going to reiterate the thought that all these ideas about how to get our offers accepted, it's the buyer's offer. And so I hear agents say, oh, I always write this in, or I always write that in. It's the buyer's offer. And so particularly if they're willing to purchase the property without it appraising for the purchase price, they've got to be 100% that I might even want to get it in writing, that they understood what that meant, and means they need the cash to pay the price. That one's very, and of course, that has to do if they're paying cash, the loan to value on their loan, rather their lender, if the appraisal comes in low, is their loan to value below that? So there are a lot of thoughts put into that. It's just a possibility. Back to our inspection time frames, using the shortest possible inspection time frames, particularly if the seller is going to be asked to make any repairs, or if the buyer is retaining the right to terminate after the inspection. They like to know as quickly as possible how the situation, that this is a firm contract. And if it is contingent on them making repairs or on the inspection, then making that time frame as short as possible. Maybe you even have already touched base with your a couple of inspectors to see how quickly you can get somebody lined up. Don't include any unnecessary contingencies. You know, this is not the time for somebody to say, oh, this is contingent upon Aunt Joe coming from California to look at the property with me and giving me an extra approval. You know, when working with buyers, I actually like to ask, is there anybody else that needs to be involved in making this decision? You know, the market is moving. It may have slowed down a little bit, but this spring and summer, the market's been moving so fast. You need to be sure that everybody that was involved to make a decision is already looking at the property and helping on the very front end. I've had some agents suggest that they felt like one of the things that they had written in that the buyer was willing to offer a home warranty to the seller. And of course, if you write it at the time that the offer is written, and it covers the seller until closing, that's an unusual. Usually, you're asking the seller for a warranty if that's desired by the buyer, but consider offering it for the seller. Ask the listing agent if there are any other important issues for the seller. And as I said, time of closing, or maybe it is more important to the seller that they not be asked to do any repairs because they're already out of town, or you know, something along that line. So is somebody else got an idea of something they've used to have an offer accepted? Anyone?
I do.
Good.
I have my client write a letter, you know, about themselves, maybe their children, that they want to see their children grow up in this house, yada yada.
Well, I think that we might talk about, we call those love letters, right, James? Yes. And I think we're going to talk about love letters at the 10 o'clock hour. So there are a lot of those written, and I'm glad you brought those up because we're definitely going to talk about that. Some yays and nays. Anybody else have something they want to suggest that they do, or that they wonder if it would be helpful, or should they suggest some way to have an offer accepted? Anybody?
I just had one last couple days ago. Offer more money than the list price, even though the house may not appraise, because when the appraisal comes in, you're at least in a negotiating position where everybody else is out.
You know, you know what? Definitely. They're certainly going above appraisal, and I'm saying I've seen this. I've heard stories this summer of houses, offers being made 20, 30,000 above list price, and the appraisal's working above list price. And yet, I've also heard a debate in our office. One of the agents said, oh yeah, I'm gonna let the buyer offer as much as they want to, and then if it doesn't appraise, yes, and we can renegotiate. Then there are others who are understanding that, knowing that you're offering so high above an appraisal price on the hopes of being the one standing to negotiate. Is that really I don't know, is fair the right word? I'm really kind of, it's a discussion to have with the seller. I've also heard listing agents counsel their sellers when they had some offers. They've actually not taken the one that was the highest because they felt it was way beyond the possibility of appraising, and it would be a renegotiating. They stepped back and accepted a solid offer that the offer price might have actually been a little less, but they felt like they were more in the appraisal range and not take the highest one. So it's a kind of a debate. Hey, this is not a science. It is not black and white. It is an art, I think, and we're all trying to understand the art a little bit. Anybody else with a thought about that before we talk about considering an escalation clause, which I think has kind of been made us a little bit nervous thinking about it because it's not something where some of us are comfortable with using, and maybe there's a good reason for that. Anybody else?
I have a question.
Okay.
I just made an offer this past weekend, and the agent came back and countered. We put our my buyer's letter from the bank with the bank information, and we put contingent on close of home, which it's going to close in October on the 13th. They came back and wanted the buyers for the buyers of the seller's bank information, a letter.
I didn't follow exactly. Help me again.
Okay, we put a letter, my buyer put a letter from their bank to show they were good for the
Right.
loan. And they were offering more than the asking price,
Okay.
and they made a solid offer. But the agent came back and wanted me to send a copy of the buyers on their home that's gonna close in October.
Oh,
Their
I think that is
information from their lender also.
absolutely. So your offer wasn't contingent on the buyer's home closing, was it?
It was contingent on closing. The buyer wanted to be sure their home closed, which they were
Absolutely.
99% sure it would.
However, no, I really think that's an excellent point. If I were the listing agent and the only offer I was going to take had that contingency in it on a property closing, I definitely would want to see details about that contract on that buyer's house. I'd want to know the lender that was involved. I might, and I don't know how much they would tell me. Julie said yesterday she was amazed at what the lenders would tell. They're not supposed to tell a lot, but they do. And hey, it's not against the rules for me to ask. So I would call, if I were the listing agent and your buyer wrote an offer and it had a contingency that their house needed to close, I would want to know who the lender was, and I would call the lender on the buyer of your buyer's house, and I would find out about that loan. I definitely would. I think that's an absolutely good thing to do.
Thank you.
And you know what? Heaven help us. How many are you in the domino of 6 or 7, or is that the only other one?
It was one other came in.
Well, I meant, how many houses have to close for ours to work? Are we in the position of 4 houses to close, or just that one of your buyer? But I would definitely want to talk to that loan. To that good listing agent, I believe, would have done that. So bravo for that. Y'all provided that information for her, I'm sure.
Well, they wanted more earnest money, and the buyer didn't want to go forward. They got a little buyer's remorse in the meantime.
Oh, that's a shame. Okay. But good for that listing agent. I bet you were in competition. Did they say there were multiple offers?
Yeah, they came with one other offer.
Okay.
That's right.
So we want that information before they would accept or counter?
Yes. Okay. All right. So now we've thought of all the things that I know to think of to add to the value of an offer. What about considering an escalation clause? I'm going to turn it over to Julie, who is going to talk about the nitty gritty of our escalation clauses.
Okay. Good morning again, and I want to thank Susan for this great graphic. I love it. So I have been getting a lot of questions this summer and last summer about escalation clauses, and they can be a little more tricky than you might think. A lot of people initially just asking, what is an escalation clause? Well, as you can see on your screen there, it's a provision in a contract that is used to change the purchase price of whatever somebody's buying. Prices could go up or down, and they're related to certain other events or indices, things like that, depending on what your contract's for or what you're buying. Like gas and oil contracts, they have escalation clauses based on different things. Of course, we're talking about residential real estate contracts. So the event or the action that normally would trigger the escalation is that there's another offer for a higher purchase price. And then, as we're talking about buyers who want to try to have their offer be accepted, but they want to try to not pay too much for it, they ask about escalation clauses. And these are used, I would think, in commercial contracts more often than residential contracts, but could be. And of course, why do we use it? What do you want to do? That's the whole thing we're talking about. You want the seller attention. You want them looking at your offer, so you could potentially be the successful buyer. And of course, that's talking about money. But be careful, be cautious. It is a little tricky. Not all buyers understand it. Not all sellers understand it. And sellers might get nervous when they see that because they don't understand it. So that may kick your offer out immediately because they don't even want to deal with it. You may have a listing agent who doesn't understand it on the seller side. And the confusion makes them nervous. And then some sellers, as I've heard people talking around the office and phone calls that I get, the sellers are mad about that escalation clause. You know, like, well, if you can pay that much more, buyer, offer me that much more. Why are you making me go through these hoops for this silly game? Just offer me the money. So they don't even want to deal with a buyer who the seller might perceive as, is it serious enough to just offer their highest and best off the bat? And again, the buyers don't understand what they're offering or how that's going to work. They may, again, like to see that they might can save some money, but again, as Carol said, it's not a science, it's a practice, and you out there on the front lines have to be the ones to weigh the emotions, weigh the environment, weigh your market to whether or not you want to talk to your buyers or sellers about contracts with escalation clauses. But you do need to know that they're out there and basically what it involves. So here's a sample escalation clause. I guess I'll just read it because it's too quiet if I don't read it. Buyer's offer is for purchase price of X amount. Buyer will increase the purchase price in increments of $2,000 over other offers that include a purchase price of X amount. But buyer will not exceed a purchase price of Y amount. Increased purchase price is contingent on buyer seeing and reading other bona fide offers received by the seller. So this is just the basic short and sweet escalation clause. It says the buyer's initial purchase price, their bottom price, if you will. And they sort of put in this automatic bidding war. You know, y'all all probably done bids online where you can input, you know, I'll increase my price by increments of $5 up to $5 up to this amount. So if I can buy that super fabulous thing, I really just have to have. And so this could be an area where you talk with your buyer about how much money are we, how much money are we going to do for offer of increments? Does 2,000 look good to the seller? Would 1,000 look better or not? 5,000 look better or not? That's something to talk to the buyer about. And then the buyers, you should put some sort of maximum offer you're going to have in there. Otherwise, you get your buyer in trouble, get your buyer committed to something they can't afford or don't have the cash liquidity to be able to do in a timely fashion. And you're going to have a buyer that gets in breach when they can't perform. So it's a good idea to talk to your buyer about having a max amount they're going to buy. And the last part, the buyer should want to see that there's an actual bona fide contract that's higher than their offered purchase price. Agents get a little nervous about this because agents, real estate agents, want to maintain the confidentiality of their customers' information. You have an ethical obligation to do that. The states require you to do that. So lots of people get nervous when they say, oh my God, you can't show my offer to somebody else. Well, you can. Once that offer leaves the buyer side, gets to the seller side, it's not confidential. It's in the seller's hands. And they can kind of do what they want to do with it. Now, realtors are ethical people, so they don't just willy-nilly disclose what information on all these offers that they've received. But if you've got an escalation clause, you've got a buyer who wants to see the next highest offer, you can redact the other buyer's offeror's name and other personal information that's really not the crux of what the buyer with the escalation clause wants to see. So only leave their last name, only leave their purchase price showing and their other contingencies and whatnot. Leave their agent's last name showing, so they know there's really another agent out there and there's a real other buyer out there. So they can see that there is something else, and whether or not they want to believe that their price isn't just being driven up for greed. Any questions at this point?
I think the only other comment I want to make is if you are working with a buyer, okay, just make sure they understand that other people making offers on that same property may see their offer.
Yeah.
Just get that conversation going at time of writing the offer. If you know it's a multiple offer situation, that seller does have the right, once it's in their hands, it's their offer. If they need to, I mean, I do believe you should redact. If you're the listing agent, you should redact the people's names at least and cover over it. Just personal privacy maybe, but the amounts and the contingencies and all of that within the offer, I mean, all of that can be shared. Just making sure your buyer understands that so they don't get angry in the long run.
Right. I would just, say, don't redact the whole name, leave something so you can show there's really somebody in that blank, not something created by the listing agent. Good points. Yeah. This talks about when and all of that. Example of escalation clauses. In the event any other bona fide offers to purchase are received by the seller prior to the binding agreement date, any other offer has a purchase price higher than what buyer has offered, then buyer will increase its purchase price to X. Buyer shall read and determine if any other offers are bona fide before paying any higher purchase price. So another short and simple one, may get your buyer where they want to be. Now, other things to think about beyond these basic initial escalation clauses. That any increase, you may want to add some language like this, any increase in the purchase price over buyer's original offer to purchase for X, Z, will be paid by buyer and shall not be a concern in the event the appraisal does not support the increased purchase price, but does support the original offer purchase price. It sounds a little confusing, but as someone mentioned earlier, they offered a lot over list price to get in the game and try to negotiate, knowing that they're about to get the seller to negotiate down. Some sellers, some listing agents are getting wise to that. And so their pushback is, okay, great, but whatever you're paying over it, you're paying cash and you're bringing it to the table. I want more assurance that you really are serious about this price you're offering. Any questions about that? Other things to think about. Buyers offered any obligation to increase the purchase price. When is that triggering event withdrawn or void or stopped? Is that offer to increase by whatever increment done once there's a binding agreement date with that buyer on that contract with the escalation clause? Is that offer to keep increasing your price done once the transaction you're involved in is 10 days out to closing. So there needs to be a time period when the buyer's obligation to keep increasing their purchase price stops, so that when a seller receives another offer, at some point, even after about an agreement date, is it triggered to go ahead and increase their purchase price anymore? Now, this has been sort of a confusing topic. So if anybody wants to talk about this one, let's talk about it.
First I was kicked out for a second, so you may have said this. For those of you not in the Tennessee market, because I'd never heard this until I moved to Tennessee, bad binding agreement date. So make sure people understand that.
Yeah. It's used in Mississippi and Arkansas, I think. Right.
Well, I want to chime in here. Julie's legal brain makes everything really black and white. Until she had discussed this with me a day or two ago, I don't think it occurred to me that anybody would ever dream that if an offer came in after we had a accepted agreement, that anybody would expect that I would continue my buyer would continue to increase the purchase price. That was a whole talk. But unless my escalation clause, which I think she has another one coming up that you can use, unless my escalation clause stated that there were no more escalations beyond our original offer acceptance. Does anybody else find that unusual, that you didn't think about, that we needed a date, that things had to be at which the escalation was no longer going? Does anybody find that unusual? I did. So
I've never considered it, but it makes perfect sense because you can take offers all the way up until closing.
and you're supposed to continue to offer until closing under certain circumstances, and therefore a backup agreement might come into play, which we're going to talk about in our third hour today, 11 or 12, wherever you are. So I just never thought about that, and so I'm just saying that all those dates that she's talking about are, for clarification, are really critically important. So, okay, ready for the next?
Carol and Julie, it's especially I could see that being an issue if you also had the contingency of another house selling. If the seller says, I've received another acceptable offer, we want to increase your escalation clause at that point, or, we're going to accept this other offer, so you got to tell us something there. So maybe that could work together with that.
So the theory behind the first one, the first suggestion, once there's about an agreement date, or once we have an agreement, is okay, both parties agree, this is our purchase price, we're moving forward. There's not going to be any more escalation. But say you've offered $250,000 at $2,000 increments over the next highest offer up to $270,000, and you're the successful offeror, and your purchase price ends up being $260,000, and you got a binding agreement date, and you're going forward. But somebody who just really loves that house and is just insistent on being a backup offer, even though they know that you've got a contract already underway, submits an offer for $165,000.
You said 260. So
Yeah, sorry, 265. Yeah, 260,000. So then, the seller could come back and say, all right, you got to go $2,000 over 260, or 267. Get my numbers messed up. Unless you have that, first suggestion in there, but your seller may think, well, you've got contingencies that I'm accepting in yours that maybe I'm not too comfortable with, so I am going to continue to market it. I am going to continue to take backup offers. So I want you to meet other purchase prices I might receive up until all your contingencies are cleared, or up until 10 days before the closing date. Seller may want to kind of hold a buyer's feet to the fire and hold out trying to get a little more money if they can. Okay, so here's a pretty good escalation clause that an attorney wrote for someone that I've seen, and We'll just read it because that's what we've been doing. We have time to read all that? Yeah. Buyer's net purchase price, i.e. purchase price less seller concessions, known as NPP, is blank. In the event that seller receives another offer for a higher NPP, then buyer's NPP offer shall be increased to blank above the NPP of the other offer under the following conditions. The other offer received by seller must be a bona fide written offer from an unrelated third party and received no later than termination or acceptance of this offer. So they're doing both right there. They're making sure the seller has the opportunity or the buyer has the opportunity to verify other offers are real. And that there's a cutoff period. The cutoff period is once we have an accepted agreement. The other offer must be presented to buyer or buyer's agent no later than the termination acceptance of this offer. Seller may redact the identifying information from the third party if necessary, but the other offer remains subject to the verification by buyer. So as I guess it was Donna's goal, that listing agent wanted to verify lots of things about the offer. In no event shall buyer's adjusted offer exceed blank amount. So they got a cutoff of how much they're actually going to pay. Buyer and seller shall memorialize acceptance of buyer's adjusted offer and the corresponding final purchase price by an amendment to this purchase and sale agreement or a counter offer made by seller and accepted by buyer. Now, you want that fourth provision in there or something to pin down what the actual purchase price is, because what does the lender want to see? What does your closing and title company want to see? They want to see an agreement on a price. They don't want to see some other offer you got and the price that that offer included. And so they can figure out what your purchase price is. You need something to memorialize in writing what it's actually going to be. So counter offer is good for that. Just pick up the phone, send some emails, work it out, figure out what that figure is, send the counter offer with that number. I don't know if there's a better way to do that. Now, does anybody see anything in here in this example that might cause some problems down the road? Give you a second.
I don't know if it'll cause a problem with this language, but you got to make sure and include that language that about seeing the other offer, you know, the other bona fide offer and things like that. I personally have received them where it had nothing like that in there. It just said, we'll increase it X number of dollars to X price. And the seller looked at me and said, well, why aren't they paying X price if they're willing to pay that? And I said, well, why don't we just go ahead and counter offer them at X price if they're willing to pay that? So it's really important to think this through and understand, you know, touch all the bases you need to touch, because if you don't include something about some, you know, seeing the offer or some kind of offer, even if you do include that, you know, the seller may say, well, I want to counter offer them because they're telling me that's how much they'll end up paying for it.
Mm-hmm.
When I first saw this language about the net purchase price, which obviously is the total consideration when you're evaluating a lot of offers, you know, what is the net to the seller, because different purchasers are required, maybe one offer is asking for closing and not another. I first thought, gee, why are we fooling with this net purchase price? Why are we just going with the purchase price? And yet, if I am making this offer to pay above another person's offer, they may have increased their offer initially to cover closing costs, and my offer my increased offer, escalation, if you will, needs to be based on what the seller would net. Because we could have someone that bumped a price up, in Julie's example, bumped the price up to $260, asking for $5,000 closing. And if I pay $5,000 above their net, I'm at $260. and yet the seller's netting $5,000 more. So that's a little unusual. I think that's a different little bit of a different thought than what some of us have had for escalation clauses. Is anybody in the group that wants to talk about an escalation clause experience that they've had? Something to add? Somebody was about to unmute themselves. You want to talk about an escalation clause experience, yay, nay, or ask a question about this? This may be totally.
I've used the escalation clauses in the past. I like to use them. I generally get warned about being careful about using them, primarily because up until now, nobody's provided any kind of legal language about using them, and we're not supposed to generate legal language ourselves. So my escalation clause is very similar to what's up on the screen because I basically got it from other agencies besides TAR. I have agents I know in other areas, and I've used them to give me their escalation clauses, and I've used that language in mine. But the biggest problem I found with escalation clauses is most listing agents don't get trained in them. So they get scared when they receive them and don't know what to do.
Yes, and I do. I honestly do think that's true. Now, I've had recently, one of the reasons we sort of thought, ooh, we need to talk about escalation clauses. We've had multiple people text about or send a message, oh, is there an escalation clause form? You know, is there official language from any of our states? And we did some research. Did we find it? We found, I mean, we work in 7 to 9 states, depending on your definition, and licensees in 9 states. We couldn't find anybody that actually had state suggested escalation clause language. So I think you have to turn to your attorneys and be very careful. And I think Julie had an early point that sometimes if you put that in your offer, it just scares the bejesus out of a seller or the other agent doesn't know. And one of the most important things I think is that memorializing of the final price, putting those time limits in there so nothing, you would hate for a buyer to get surprised. I can't imagine actually we'll talk about first right of refusals later today, but I can't imagine trying to use a first right of refusal and an escalation clause and a buyer, which you remove that, when you're called on that contingency and get the sudden shock that, oh, now I'm also supposed to increase my price. So all those timelines are really, really critical. Anybody else have a thought about some of these crazy things?
I know Mark's been in several of my forms and contracts training classes over in the Nashville area when I go over there. And we talk about this sometimes, but he's 100% correct. And Carol, in the Tennessee residential forms committee meetings, we've discussed this multiple times.
Right.
And decided not to give that language because of the risk that's actually taken doing this and what can come back on the agents. And if you're in Tennessee, your Tennessee Digest this week, there were 3 questions and answers from the hotline attorney about escalation clauses. And it's a good thing to go in there and look at that language.
Okay, so Neil Hubbard has posted in the chat a buyer risk tolerance PDF. Will you tell them about that, Neil?
Sure, that is adapted from Ninja, and it will give you great discussion points as your first meeting with a buyer to talk about some of these different areas and identify, what is their comfortable risk tolerance level in those different areas. So it's it's kind of a high to low risk in 6 different areas, and I just think it's a good conversation starter, whether you're talking with your buyer about it or potentially in reviewing offers with your seller.
Right. So if you will look in the chat area, if you're on the call, and there's a little option to download that PDF, it'll just download it right to your computer. And if you don't get that accomplished, if you'll send me an email this afternoon, we'll try to send that out again as well. And we will, I'm going to ask Julie, someone asked in the chat, Miss Julie, may we add that escalation clause, that final one that we talked about, may we add that in transaction desk for a clause that can be added to anyone's agreement? See, she has reservations. She has reservations about it. Let's talk about it quickly. You know, we have a couple more minutes.
But if you want some language to show the potential buyer, and talk to them about escalation clauses, show them that language. They may have their own ideas about what it needs to say, which they can because it's their offer. And sellers can make changes to it and send it back to you. And their counter offers if that's what they're going to do. I would suggest, before you just take that language and start sticking it in every one of your offers, don't do that. Talk to your buyers about it ahead of time. Talk to them about your market and how hard it is to get their offers accepted so they can fully understand this option to make their offer look the most attractive to the seller. So we gave you two fairly simple ones. We gave you one very detailed one. Is you've got to be very careful and have good communication with your customer about what it's going to mean. The riskiest thing is to get them into a contract to pay a price that they cannot pay.
Good final point. Anybody else have another?
These are illegal in some states.
Oh, I forgot.
That's how tricky they are. They're illegal in some states.
Actually, they're illegal in Texas, which we discovered. So everybody's not in agreement that it's a fabulous process. So with caution, we talk about that. But as we started our class this morning, there are lots of things that you can do to make your offer more attractive. Escalation clause is just one that's kind of a buzzword most recently. So anybody else have other quick question? It's almost time to log off. We're going to, at our next hour, we're going to talk, okay, now we've written the best offer we can write, but we're up against competing with, we've been told there are 10 or 12 other offers. So next hour, we're going to talk what we're going to do about, as listing agents and buyer's agents, what we're going to do about multiple offers. So with that, if there are not any other questions, I'll end this call. Susan, are you waving at me? You want to say something? Just bye. Oh, thank you.